Okay, let's get started. So yesterday we talked all about flavor and flavor structure. So the next step in the F-step process is S, which is sauce. And so it's important to talk about flavor before sauce because a sauce is nothing more than just flavor structure and technique applied together. And you're going to see this time and time and time again. A dish is flavor structure plus technique plus execution. That's it. Okay, that's our basic formula. So now that we understand flavor structures, we understand how fat can give you a great mouthfeel, but also deaden seasoning, and acid can cut it. We also understand that we need a certain level of salt in our food, and we concentrate flavors through reduction. Now we can actually talk about sauces. So to understand sauces, we need to put them in the historical context of the 5 French mother sauces. And if you go online, if you go to stellaculinary.com/mother, there is a whole index page. We have an hour audio lecture on each of the 5 French mother sauces. We also have 2 one-hour lectures on stocks, so they go really in depth into that. We're going to talk a little bit about today to put it into context, but if you want more information, that's a good place to start.
I'm sorry, what was that again?
It's stellaculinary.com/mother, and you'll see a link in your sauce section in the book. It'll be in there. Okay. So if you go to culinary school anywhere in the West, in Europe, in Canada, in America, they're going to teach you the 5 French mother sauces. And so this was created. You had a guy named Crareme, and Crareme was sort of like the grandfather of French cuisine. And he created the 4 French mother sauces. And his mother sauces were Veloute, brown sauce, sauce tomate, tomato sauce, but French style, and Hollandaise. And the idea of the mother sauces is their bases. So you learn this base, and then you add other ingredients, and you make secondary sauces. That's what they called, or derivative sauces. So in Carame's Veloute, it was basically veal stock or any sort of white stock, whether it's fish stock, chicken stock, white veal stock, and he would add a good amount of milk to it to kind of enrich it, or cream, and then he would add a roux to thicken it. And basically what happened is Escoffier, who was the father of French cuisine, who came after Crareme, came along and said, no, what I want to do is I want to have a 5th mother sauce, and I want to create Bechamel, which is just a milk-based sauce, okay? So now this Veloute has the milk taken out, and you have a separation between Bechamel and Veloute. So Veloute, these are all very, very simple sauces that are meant to be improved upon, ingredients added to create your own secondary sauces. So Veloute is a white stock, meaning the bones aren't roasted. White stock plus white roux. And a roux is just a mixture, a 1-to-1 mixture by weight of butter and flour cooked together in a pan. And for your roux, you have white, blonde, brown, and that's the classic codification of roux. Then you have like the Creoles come along in Louisiana and be like, well, we're going to have a 4th roux, which is black roux. And that's where you get a lot of complex flavor and the color of a gumbo. Okay, but in classic French cuisine, white, blonde, brown. A brown sauce is basically a roasted stock or a brown stock plus brown roux. And technically speaking, what they would do for this stock is they would immediately turn it into a demi-glace. So they take a brown stock, they would thicken it with a brown roux, then they would take more brown stock, half and half, and they combine the brown sauce and the brown stock together, reduce it by half, and call it a demi-glace. Demi just means half. So it's a half glaze, right? But kind of a redundant approach, if you ask me. Okay, but that's just, we're talking classic sauce making right now. Sauce tomate is tomato sauce. So tomato's your base, cooked down. They like to add stock to it sometimes, and they'll add like pork fat and the aromatics. Plus roux, it's thickened by a roux. Bechamel is milk, plus, you guessed it, roux. And Hollandaise is your basic emulsion. So it's egg yolks, and it's thickened with butter, clarified butter traditionally, but you can use regular butter. So the idea is all of these, no matter what sauce you wanted to make in classic French cuisine or in European style cuisine, one of these sauces would be your base, and then you'd come along and you would add some tarragon and some lemon juice, maybe some bone marrow, and then you name it after, some French duke, and it'd be a new sauce. But when you look at it, it's extremely redundant, right? Liquid, thickened with roux, liquid, thickened with roux, liquid, thickened with roux, liquid, thickened with roux. Emulsion. Covers your mayonnaise, covers your aioli. Hollandaise is a hot emulsion. If you chill it down, you swap out your clarified butter for some olive oil and you add in some garlic, and you got aioli. Okay, very, very redundant. And what happens is, so they teach these mother sauces at culinary school, and students, they miss the forest for the trees. They get so focused on these 5 French sauces as bases, and then they start to memorize the hundreds and hundreds of secondary sauces. Why? Who cares? Why do you need that, right? Because it's 2 techniques, both of which are extremely, extremely redundant. So what I did to kind of take a jab at the French, but it also made more sense to me, is I coined the 3 modern mother sauces. And it's basically my technique approach to sauce making in the kitchen. So 3 modern mother sauces. Because my argument is, no matter what sauce you want to make, there are 3 techniques that you can apply to sauce making. Once you master those 3 techniques, which all have a best practice, right? You can't automatically change the emulsification technique because it's based in science, right? You can't just say, well, I'm going to make an emulsification this way. Well, it's not going to happen because that emulsification is going to break on you, right? So the 3 modern mother sauces are all based upon a technique with best practice, a technique that's rooted in science. And then once you master that technique through an understanding of how it works, you just add flavor structure on top. Way simplified, right? So you want to make an emulsion, fine. Well, what's an emulsion? It's fat and water combined together, right? And then you add a flavor on top of that. So you're making an emulsion because of texture. So the 3 modern mother sauces are reduction, emulsion, and puree. Any sauce that you make will fall into one of these 3 categories. Okay? So now the journey begins. So let's talk reduction. So we played with reductions yesterday in the kitchen. So what makes a reduction sauce and why would you reduce something? Well, there's two reasons for reduction. Reason number one is to thicken the sauce. Reason number two is to intensify flavor. You can take a stock made with just chicken breasts, extract the chicken breast flavor into the sauce, reduce it down. It won't thicken, but the flavor will intensify. Now, the reason why it doesn't thicken is because of this little thing right here. And we touched on it briefly yesterday, and now we're going to talk about it more today. And we'll talk about it even more tomorrow when we talk about cooking technique. So this little triple helix right here, called collagen. Now collagen is the connective tissue in muscle fibers that allow muscles to contract and be sturdy and do work. Okay? So the more work a muscle does, the more work a joint does, the more collagen it needs to be structurally intact, right, to do its job. So something like a chicken that's bred to have large breasts because the U.S. population loves their white meat, and God knows why. I mean, it's dry and awful, but that's neither here nor there. I guess we're all health nuts. But what happens, right, so they're bred to carry around these big, large breasts that they shouldn't have in the first place. So what happens? They're walking around on their legs, and their legs are getting a ton of work done, right? So the legs are dark. Now the legs are dark, they're dark meat because of myoglobin. Myoglobin is what transfers oxygen to the muscle to do work. It transfers it through the blood, okay? So the more myoglobin a muscle has, the more color it will have, and also the more flavor it will have. That's why chicken thighs have more flavor than chicken breasts, but it's also why they're tougher, because of collagen, because they do more work. Now what happens though is when you apply long, slow heat, whether you're braising or you're simmering a stock for hours, this collagen will break down into 3 individual strands of gelatin. So it's actually 3 strands of gelatin that make up the triple helix of collagen. Now this is important because the gelatin is what dissolves into our stock when we take big veal knuckle bones or we take a couple of whole chicken carcasses and we roast them and we simmer them for hours. It not only extracts the flavors from the bone and the flavors from any flesh or meat, but it also breaks this collagen down into gelatin. Now when we then take our stock that has gelatin in it and reduce it down, we're basically removing the water, okay? So you remove water, which increases the ratio of particulate matter or dissolved solids. Which is mainly your gelatin. And so as you evaporate more water out through the simmering process, your stock becomes thicker or your sauce becomes thicker. And that's the reduction phase. Now, also because you're evaporating water out, you're leaving behind a more concentrated version of particles. So parts per million, you have more flavor particles in your reduced stock or sauce than you would in a stock that was just extracted, that was just finished. Make sense? So, this all starts with a stock. Well, what is stock? A stock is basically just an extraction of flavor into water. That's it. But you have your classic stocks, your 3 classics, or 4 classic stocks really. It's going to be a fish-based, veal-based, chicken-based, or vegetable-based. Okay? The veal stock is the workhorse of the professional kitchen. That's where you get your demi-glaces, that's where you get a lot of your braising liquids. But you can make great stocks with any sort of poultry, any animal really, right? But those are the most classic stocks that you're going to find. So a stock, we'll take into consideration, we'll just go through the process of making a veal stock because that's what we use a lot to make our demi-glaces. So for a veal stock, you got bones. And not just any bones, you want the knuckle bones. Why? Because they contain a lot of collagen. Okay?
Why veal over just beef?
Because beef is a large, older animal, and it tastes sweaty and musty. Yeah, so beef has a much stronger flavor, and then you take that flavor, you extract it out in a stock, and you reduce it. Then you have a really strong, almost off-putting, gamey flavor. That's why in the United States, or just anywhere, where they produce animals for consumption, they're slaughtered at a very young age. They're brought to age very quickly. I mean, when you eat a chicken, you're looking at a chicken that was, hatched and brought to market in less than 12 weeks. Right? Anything longer than that, it gets tough. It contains a lot more flavors, what we associate with gamey, and we're fancy people. We don't like our meat to taste gamey. We want our chicken to taste like succulent chicken. We want our beef to taste like succulent beef. We don't want to have those extra flavors. So anytime you reduce anything, you're concentrating the flavors, good or bad. So if you reduce a beef stock, it's not a bad flavor, but it's different, and most people won't like it. Okay? So knuckle bones, you can use shank bones, neck bones, really any bone that moves a large portion of the animal will work for this. And you want to use bones because they contain a lot of collagen. Whereas there's pieces of meat that contain collagen, but not nearly as much as bones do. The veal knuckle bones contain about 40% collagen. All right, so you can get a really good extraction from them. But bones don't have a whole lot of flavor. You usually get your flavor from the little bits and pieces of meat that are still stuck to the bone, and you roast it. And you can then later go back and reinforce with more flavor. So if you're using the stock to braise some short ribs, you brown the short ribs, you braise it, some of the flavor from the short rib meat infuses into that stock, you reduce the sauce down, and now you have a flavorful sauce. Okay? So you have your bones. You can either roast them or blanch them. The blanching process for a white stock is you basically cover your bones with cold water. You bring it to a simmer. As soon as it comes to a simmer, you pour off that water, and then you refill it with water, and then your white mirepoix. So you don't roast any of your mirepoix. And we'll go over that in a second. And what that does is it coagulates the proteins on the stock or on the bones, and you get some of that fat and that scum rises to the surface, and you're dumping all that off. So it's to give you a clear, clean flavor. All right, and that's used like a veloute is a white stock, so that's the application of that. But if I want to make like a lighter soup, like if I'm going to make it like a white chicken consomme, I'll use a white stock. So I'll take the chicken carcasses, I'll first blanch them by covering with cold water, bring it to a simmer, pour it off, and I'll build my stock on top of that. The second variation, which is much more flavorful, is a roasted stock. And you take your veal bones, you rub them down with oil, all right? A lot of chefs will tell you don't use oil, roast them dry, but oil conducts heat much better than just dry air and the moisture that's on the bones. And no matter what you do, you're going to have to skim your stock anyways. And that's their argument is, well, it just gives you more fat to skim later. Well, that's okay. I'll trade skimming more later for more roasted flavor up front. So I'll rub them with oil, roast them in the oven until they're dark golden brown. Place them in a pot with mirepoix that's also roasted. And mirepoix is just the basic aromatics. It's 2 parts onion, 1 part celery, 1 part carrot. So you take your mirepoix, you cut it up. I never peel mine. I like the peels. I think they add a good, because you're just going to toss it at the end, right? It's not a part of your sauce. I think the peels, especially onion peels and garlic peels, actually add a good earthy flavor to the stock. So that's a personal preference. You can play around and you can decide whether or not you want to peel your vegetables. All the chefs I've ever worked for, though, they don't peel them either. So it kind of seems to be the industry standard. So this is to add background flavor, right? This is what we call aromatic. So this is going to infuse into your beef stock or your veal stock or your chicken stock, and it's going to make the flavors more round, right? And a lot of that comes from the volatile aroma molecules that we talked about yesterday in that sauce or in that stock. Then you have your sachet, which, to be honest with you, never really made sense to me. It's just a fancy French thing. The ingredients in this make sense, which is thyme, parsley, peppercorns, bay leaves. But they tie them up in a little cheesecloth in a cute little bundle. Or sometimes they want to be really cute, they'll take like a leek and slice it in half and stuff them inside the leek, and they'll tie the leek up and they drop it in. But it makes no sense to me because you're just going to strain it all out later. Anyways, and you save the liquid, you discard everything else. Okay, so I just always just throw this straight in there. And in classic French stock making, they'll be like, oh, you gotta have 2 sprigs of thyme and like 3 parsley stems only, and yada yada yada. Screw that. I throw in a whole bunch of thyme, a whole bunch of parsley, because I want that flavor. I want to be able to taste it. Now, there's an argument, because you take this and you simmer for a long time, because you got to break down that collagen, you got to extract the flavor. So the veal stock, veal bones, will simmer for 8 to 12 hours. So you cover all this with cold water, because what happens is if you start with cold water, you can still turn your burner onto high heat, but as that water slowly comes up to temperature, it slowly coagulates the proteins on the bones and on the surface of any meat that's on the bones. And it forms large aggregates of protein that coagulate and float to the surface, and you can skim away. Versus if you add hot water right away, it coagulates them very quickly, so you have smaller little particles that get suspended in your stock, and they cloud your stock, which doesn't really mess with your flavor, but it's just considered poor technique because you want your stock to be clear. Okay? Yes?
You said to roast your mirepoix. Can you saute it?
If you're making a roasted stock, you can roast. It's a recommend that you roast some mirepoix. Anything that adds color is fair game. The way I do it is I'll roast my bones first, and then what you have is all of this fat comes off the bones, and I'll take that, I'll pour that into a bowl, I'll toss my mirepoix on that, lay it on a sheet tray, and roast it. And that's just adding more flavor. Also, too, what I do is when I skim all the fat off of my stocks, we save that fat, and it's a mixture of water and fat, and we bring that to a simmer over low heat, and we simmer out all the water, and then I'll use that fat to roast vegetables or to sear meat, and I'll also use it in the reinforcement stage, which we're going to talk about here in a second. So you simmer 8 to 12 hours, skimming every so often. That froth that comes to the top, that fat that rises to the top, you want to skim that off, and you can save the fat or you can discard it. I opt to save it. And then you strain. Strained stock. And there you have a stock. Now you want to take your stock and you want to cool it down rapidly, because there's something called time temperature abuse. And basically, you don't want any food product between 135 on the top side and 40 degrees Fahrenheit on the low side for more than 4 hours. And the reason why is because bacteria can grow pretty well between those temperatures. So you want to when it's above 140 or when it's at a boil, it's completely sterile. But if you take that stock and you boil it and then you let it come to room temperature slowly, there could be issues with bacteria, but honestly, this is really erring on the very, very safe side. And also, too, if you then, I mean, there's people who I know that will, at home, they take a stock, they simmer it, whatever, and they'll just turn it off and they'll leave it on their stove overnight, and the next day they just bring it to a boil and use it. And once you bring it to a boil, it's going to be pretty much sterile. But if you're going to store it in your fridge, you ideally want to cool it in an ice bath. So you just fill your sink with ice, you place the pot in there, you cool it down rapidly, because that way you're going to make sure you have a sterile stock, but also when you place it in a small fridge at home, it's going to heat up your fridge, so you run the risk of other items in there spoiling. Okay? Now there's a school of thought that says, hey, this mirepoix right here, you shouldn't add that until the end, because after simmering for an hour, the mirepoix or the vegetables basically give everything they can give in flavor. And then after that, the flavors start to change and break down. That's why you only simmer a vegetable stock for about 45 to 60 minutes. But my thing is first of all, adding a bunch of mirepoix up front and then having it extracted and break down into the stock and kind of become homogeneous with that sauce flavor is part of the background flavor of that stock. Because a stock is never used as is, ever. A stock is a base, right? This is why during this entire process you never add salt. Because once a stock is made, you're going to reinforce. So no salt in stock, ever. No salt. In fact, anything that's that's stock-based, you're only going to add salt at the very end when you check for final seasoning. Because every stock that we make, we go through a reinforcement, plus reduction. So we have our stock. Now it's time to make something with our stock. Now if I want to make a veal demi-glace, because we just made a veal stock, so if I want to make a veal demi-glace and serve it in the restaurant, here's what I do. Take more mirepoix, and I'll roast it in the bottom of a pot with beef fat, because I got to use some sort of fat, right? So why not use my extracted beef fat? If you don't have any, you can just use cooking oil. That's fine. So I roast and I caramelize it in the bottom of the pot. Okay? So at home, just like a 12-quart stock pot, there's going to be plenty of space for you to do this. Here at the restaurant, because we're using large quantities, that big 4-burner rondo that you saw yesterday, we'll roast down the mirepoix on that, and we'll get it nice and hot and caramelize it. Now what happens is this creates a fond on the bottom of the pan. That fond is those brown little nummy bits that brown and stick to the bottom of your pan when you're cooking something. Okay? And they contain a lot of flavors, basically caramelized proteins and caramelized starches. So you want to extract that flavor. So then you deglaze. And deglazing is basically just extracting that flavor via steam, like we were talking about yesterday. So just a little bit of water in the pan is plenty to deglaze it, because what happens is you add just enough to get that rapid steam to generate, and then you just scrape. You take the flat edge or a wooden spoon, you scrape vigorously. Okay, and that's how you extract your fond. And now it's being simmered into your deglazing liquid. Now if I'm using wine, which is pretty classic for deglazing, but you can use other forms of alcohol as well. If it's a high-proof alcohol, be careful, it's going to flame up on you. But because I'm doing a dark sauce, I'm doing a demi-glace using roasted veal stock, I'm going to use red wine, because I need something that's going to stand up to the roasted flavors of the mirepoix and the bones. If I was reinforcing a white stock, I wouldn't brown it at the bottom of the pot. I would just add fresh mirepoix to the bottom of the pot, cover it with a little bit of white wine, and then reduce. Either way, when you add your wine, you want to reduce by at least half before you add any of your other ingredients. Because what happens is if you deglaze with wine, you pour it in, you scrape, and then it comes to a simmer and you add your stock back on top immediately, your stock's going to have a sour flavor. So you haven't had a chance to cook out all the alcohol, and you haven't had a chance to concentrate and reinforce that wine flavor. Okay, so you take this wine, you reduce by half. Add stock after it's reduced. And then you reduce the stock. Now, if you have meat scraps laying around, like say you have some leftover chicken and you're making a chicken stock, or for us, like if we are fabricating beef in the kitchen, we save all of our beef scraps, we'll roast them, and then we add those scraps back into the stock because we're not going to eat them, we're just going to extract their flavor. And meat contains a lot of flavor, so now is the time to add those scraps. Okay, so that's why you want to save your scraps in little freezer bags and throw them in the freezer. Reduce this by a lot, okay, by at least half. But we'll reduce usually a minimum of 3/4. So technically, I mean, I guess to make it more clear, we're left with 1/4 of the original volume of the stock that we started with. Yeah. Yeah. Now, we're not done yet. At this point, this is just considered our flavor base. Okay? And what we do is we have literally every day, we have an ongoing reduction going. So we take the reduction from the previous day and the stock that we strained that morning, we reinforce that stock, we reduce, we combine with the reduction from the previous day, and we keep it going. And that's how we get an intense flavor with our sauces. But this right here will give you a pretty intense flavor. But you're still just at a flavor base. Now you have a reinforced and reduced stock. Now you can actually make a reduction sauce. Okay, but this right here isn't a reduction sauce yet. And the whole time, this is reducing, you're skimming. So always skim. You can remove that fat. So that's where the granddaddy of all reduction sauces comes in, which is the pan sauce, which we were working on yesterday, okay? Because with the pan sauce, what you're doing is you're reinforcing the flavor of your already reduced sauce with the item that you're going to be serving that sauce with, and then you're adding final flavorings and seasonings all minute. And that's why my argument is, well, why don't I wait till the end of the stock making process to add my mirepoix? Well, because my stock literally goes through 3 to 5 different reinforcements throughout the day. When we strain the pot, we'll add more mirepoix. And then if I want a fresh carrot flavor or a fresh thyme flavor or a fresh celery flavor, I'll add that right at the end to have that flavor come forward and to be a part of that stock or a part of that sauce. Okay? So pan sauces, again, we did a quick demo yesterday, but you're doing the pan roasting technique. So you have your saute pan, heavy bottom of course, and that's over high flame. And you want your pan to be just large enough to fit your product. So now we have a reinforced and reduced veal stock. Let's make a filet of beef, filet mignon, okay, pan roasted. So what we're going to do is we're going to get this nice and hot. We're going to let the pan charge with heat before we sear in it, before we add our oil. We're going to flick some water into the pan. When it beads up like mercury and bounces around, we know the pores in our pan are closed, and we can now add our oil. So oil goes in. Oil needs to be high temp, neutral flavor. So this means extra virgin olive oils are out. You don't want to cook with those because they break down at high temperatures and they don't have a neutral flavor. If you want the flavor of extra virgin olive oil with your filet of beef, you add it at the end like you would finishing salt. So you plate your filet, you're ready to serve it, a little bit of drizzle of olive oil. That's the correct way to use it. So here you're going to be using canola, safflower, grapeseed, clarified butter, which I love cooking with clarified butter. My preferred cooking mix is 50-50 canola oil and clarified butter. So we clarify a bunch of butter, we mix them 50-50 because clarified butter is really expensive. If you cut it in half with canola oil, you get pretty much the same positive qualities of cooking with 100% clarified butter, but it's not close to as expensive. Yes?
So are you going to teach us how to clarify butter this week?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then do you see any benefit to using, Puree versus butter in your kitchen? Do you use Puree more for just like?
Yeah, so Puree is basically the finishing butter of the world. So it's very, very high fat. Usually comes from high-end high-end farms. So you don't want to cook with it. I mean, you can finish a sauce with it. Some fancy French chefs do, but for me, if I'm going to spend the money on Puree, I'm just going to spread it on some bread, a little bit of salt, and enjoy it for what it is. It's kind of because a lot of the flavors that you get from Puree. I mean, so number one, it's a higher fat content butter, so it just tastes better because there's more fat.
No better butter.
Yeah, exactly. But you also have a lot, different beta carotenes and stuff like that comes from the fact that the cow is usually grass fed, and that's what gives it that sort of like yellowish tinge. So you're gonna miss all that if you cook with it. You're just gonna change those flavors. Okay. All right, so high temp cooking oil goes in. We sear our steak. Steak goes in the center of the pan. When you're working with round pieces of meat like scallops or steak, what I like to do is lay the edge away from me, farthest from me, place that down in the pan, and it kind of sticks to the pan and starts to coagulate the proteins, and then I'll gently push the meat in, keeping its shape. Makes sense? So instead of just taking a filet and grabbing it and just boom, slamming it in the pan, it deforms. You take the round piece of meat, you drop it in the pan, you let that corner set, and then you release the rest of the filet. That's going to keep its shape. And you can go back with tongs, and you can kind of squeeze the sides or squeeze it back into shape so it looks more round. And that's just for presentation purposes. It does help a little bit with even cooking. So you place filet in the pan, caramelize on both sides, or Maillardize, really. Maillard reaction, or Maillard reaction. Which is technically different than caramelization. Caramelization is sugar actually browned, whereas the Maillard reaction is the meat proteins that brown. So they give you that flavor of roasted meat. Okay. Sear on both sides. Once you flip it on the other side, you're going to sear a little bit less than your top side because it's going to go into an oven. So you go into a 450 to 500 degree oven. Now we always keep our ovens at 500, whether it's boot camp or whether it's regular dinner service, because there's a lot of opening and closings of the ovens going on, right? So we just crank them as high as they can go, which is 500. But really, with all opening and closing going on, they range from 425 to 450. So at home, if you're not opening your oven every 10 minutes, or every 5 minutes, or every 3 minutes, like we do during a busy service night, 425 to 450 will be sufficient for pan roasting. Okay? Cook it till it's done. Whatever your preferred finish temperature is, rare, mid-rare, medium, right? Again, if it's blobby, it's rare. If you squeeze it, it's like, it just kind of hangs there, it's rare. Okay, if you squeeze the sides and it bounces back and it's playful and it's springy, it's mid-rare to medium, right? Depending upon the variation of the spring back. If you touch it, doesn't spring back at all, it's well done. It's cooked through, it means the proteins in that steak have fully coagulated, so there's no more spring to them, okay? So when that steak is done, you pull from the oven and you set aside and let it rest. Now what you have in the bottom of the pan is your fond. Your fond is left over. Again, those brown little nummy bits, right? So now we start our final reinforcement and reduction stage. So we already have our very flavorful reinforced reduced sauce. Now it's time to do a final reinforcement and reduction, and it's at this time that you add the flavors that you want to be in the forefront of your sauce, right? So there can be really any flavors that you want. Very classic, so we're just doing a classic time wine demi-glace. What you're going to do is you have some fond and you also have some fat left over in the pan. If you're doing this technique with something like a duck breast, the duck breast probably released a lot of fat in the pan, so you're going to pour a little bit of that off so your sauce doesn't get too fatty. But you just really want just a nice even layer of fat in the pan. So then you throw in some shallots. So roast shallots or saute shallots. Now there's enough moisture in the shallots to usually release some of that fond. Because what happens is they hit that hot pan, they release their own moisture, it turns to steam. And if you scrape vigorously with the flat edge of a wooden spoon, you can get most of that stuff up. Now, yes?
Those are not cooked shallots.
Correct, yeah.
You put roast shallots, so I don't know.
Well, roast shallots, so not roasted shallots, but you're going to roast shallots in the pan. You're going to brown them. Well, roasting, we'll talk more about roasting tomorrow. But, so I guess it would be more accurate to say saute shallots or brown shallots. You can saute or brown, but usually in common vernacular, when I say, hey, just roast those for me, all I'm telling you to do is brown them. Okay. So turn those brown. Once they start to turn brown, what you're doing in this step is you're flirting with what's going to burn first, my fond or my shallots, okay? And it's always going to be your fond that burns first. So you want to get your shallots as dark as possible, obviously without burning them. You want to get them, caramelized and golden brown, before your fond starts to blacken and scorch on you, which will ruin your sauce. So you just pay attention to it, and as soon as your fond starts getting to your liking, to where it's flirting with, starting to burn, that's when you deglaze. That's when you add your liquid. So in this case, we're going to deglaze with red wine again. So deglaze with red wine, reduce that red wine by at least half, so you're cooking out the alcohol and you're concentrating the flavors of that red wine. What red wine should you use? Something inexpensive. Okay, save the good wine for drinking. When you buy some cooking Burgundy, at home, I use Carlos Rossi. It comes in those big jugs, those big glass jugs that you find at the supermarket, like $9, okay? I wouldn't want to drink it because it's the Budweiser of red wine. But in that sense, that's why it makes it good for cooking. It's not overly sweet, it's not overly tannic, it's not overly acidic, all of which flavors will intensify when you reduce it. So you kind of want just a bland red wine that's not too far off in any one area of flavor profile. All right, and then you save your good Burgundies for drinking. You can also, if you want to add a special little touch of wine flavor, is you can add some raw wine, just a little couple of dashes into your sauce at the very end right before serving. So if you have a nice burgundy, maybe you want to pair better with your sauce, that's how you use it. But the moment that wine comes anywhere close to a simmering temperature, it's going to completely change its flavor structure. If I took a $100 bottle of Burgundy, brought to a simmer and put it back in the bottle, would you want it still? No, of course not. So why would you cook with it, you know? So deglaze with red wine, add aromatics now. So this is where you add your thyme, anything else that you want, peppercorns, bay leaves, whatever you want your flavor of that sauce to be. You want it to taste like raisins, add raisins. You want it to taste like apricots, add apricots. You know, this is just, I'm walking you through a very classic example, but what it is you take your understanding of flavor structure, your own personal preferences, and this is where you create your own unique sauce at this stage right here. Add your stock that's been reduced, reinforced. And now you reduce nappe. And nappe is just the technical term for when a sauce coats the back of a spoon lightly. Okay, it naps the spoon. So that's sort of what you're looking for. Now, if you want, you don't have to take it, you don't have to stop a nappe. You could take it down further and have more of an intense, rich gloss, which is a glace de viande sort of style of sauce where it's really just literally coats the back of the spoon almost like chocolate would. But that's going to be a really intense flavor. So standard issue pan reduction sauce is you reduce to nappe, it coats the back of a spoon. Now it's time to go into our rapid finishing stage, which literally happens boom, boom, boom. Okay? So you have your sauce going, it's reducing. Now this whole time, your steak is resting, your protein is resting, and the final reduction part of this sauce, from the time you put your shallots into the pan to when you finish, is going to take you 5 to 10 minutes, which is the perfect time for a steak to rest. And the reason why it happens that quickly is because your sauce base has already been reinforced and reduced. So now you're just doing a final reduction in a pan that has a good amount of surface area, so it's going to happen pretty rapidly. Okay, so you reduce that sauce, thickens and naps the back of a spoon. Then you add butter. Why?
Flavor, no butter, no texture.
That's right, more butter, more better. But also mouthfeel, velvety, right? So that's flavor. Also, too, remember, like we talked about yesterday, that volatile aroma molecules are only fat soluble. So if you have a sauce that's completely devoid of fat, it's not going to retain some of its flavor. Now, I will admit that the fat that you use to roast the shallots is going to be enough fat to retain those aroma molecules. But the butter adds a velvety texture, adds a buttery flavor, it also gives you sort of a glossy sheen to your sauce, so it looks visually appealing. But, like we talked about yesterday, butter deadens flavors, or fat deadens flavors. It'll coat your palate. So it's not like the flavors go away, they're just not as present anymore. So you need to cut that fat. So cut the fat with acid. Classically speaking, when you're making a meat reduction sauce like this, in classical French terms, they're going to just add a little squeeze of lemon. But it could be anything you want. You can add lime, you can add grapefruit juice, you can add sherry vinegar, Moscato vinegar, champagne vinegar, anything that is acidic, you can add it here. And so this is another point at which you can define your own personal flavor structure and creativity in this very basic sauce. Okay? So you add acid. Acid cuts the butter, brings some of your flavors back, but what does acid and butter do? They both deaden salt. They both deaden seasoning. Now, during this entire process, starting from the stock making process all the way down to the pan reduction process, you have not added a single ounce of salt, not even a single gram. Because when you sear the steak, what are you going to do? you're going to sprinkle the steak with salt. You're going to sear it. That's going to season the steak. That's going to season your protein. Some of that salt will fall off into the pan. That salt is going to dissolve into your sauce. And usually just that small amount of sauce, because your sauce is so intensely flavored, that small amount of salt is going to be enough to season it. If it's not, though, if the butter and the acid have sort of washed it out, then you add salt at the very end. But you check for salt at the very end, because butter cuts salt and acid cuts salt. So you add your butter, emulsify it in. This is off the heat, all right? So that way your butter doesn't break. Butter is an emulsification, right? It's about 75% fat, 25% water, depending upon the butter you get. So it's an emulsified state. So if you bring it to a simmer, if you make it too hot, it's going to completely break on you and separate. So you're going to have separate butter and separate water content, or separate fat and separate water content. So if you gently melt it, though, where there's plenty of retained heat in the sauce to do so, it maintains emulsification as it goes into your sauce. Again, it's going to coat your palate, so you add just enough acid to brighten that sauce back up. If you want a lemon flavor, you add a little bit more lemon juice, but you could add literally a couple of drops of lemon juice, and that's going to be just enough to cut through the fat in that pan sauce and brighten it up. And then you check for final seasoning. Okay? Now you can do this on a large scale by making a reduction sauce, and then at the very end, so you have your reinforced and reduced sauce that you've taken your stock and you've reduced by about a half to a quarter of its original volume. And then you can do one more single reinforcement stage in a small sauce pot, and you kind of skim it, and you can go through the finishing stage and you add butter. And that's what you want to do if you're going to be making demi-glace for like 20 people, right? So you just have a little tiny pot, but a little bit of this sauce goes a long way. You'll need about 1 ounce to 1.5 ounces of this sauce per person being served. So even though your yield on a reduction sauce is low, you don't really have to serve that much, right? Because it has such an intense flavor. Now, there are also liquid-based sauces that need to be thickened outside of reduction. Now, in my codification, any sauce that's thickened with another substance still falls under a reduction sauce, and here's why. Is because particles are particles, right? If I'm using flour particles or starch particles in that flour to thicken my sauce, it's no different than reducing it all the way and using the gelatin particles in that sauce to thicken it. The only difference is flavor structure and appeal, and basically the applied technique, but it's still best practice to reinforce and at least slightly reduce the sauce for flavor. Does that make sense? So if I'm going to be making a Thanksgiving Day gravy, so gravy doesn't taste right without a brown roux. When I'm eating turkey on Thanksgiving, I don't want a turkey demi-glace. I want a turkey gravy. Okay, that's what I crave. So you're thickening with a roux, which is basically a 1-to-1 mixture by weight of butter and flour. And you're going to cook it in a pan over moderate heat until it turns a dark golden brown. And it's going to have a nutty aroma, and you can smell it. And you want to take it, remove from the heat, and let cool. Because what happens is, because there's so much, you can get flour and butter together a lot hotter than the boiling point of a liquid. So you add that to a boiling liquid, and it rapidly starts to boil, and it breaks apart, and it doesn't thicken your sauce. It releases flour particles and releases grease, and you got to start all over again. That's also how you get clumpy gravies. Okay. So after I set this aside, and you can do this a couple days ahead of time, you know, just kind of keep this in your fridge. I'm going to take the giblets from my turkey, so the hearts and the liver and hopefully the gizzard because it has a lot of flavor, possibly the wing tips that I cut off, right? And I'm going to brown in the bottom of a large saute pan. So what's that doing? It's generating fond, right? Once that fond is generated, now if you're really thinking ahead, because breast meat cooks at a different rate than leg and thigh meat, it's best to separate them anyways. So you get your turkey a couple of days in advance, you cut the breast meat off, you cut the leg and thigh meat off, now you have a turkey carcass that you can make a stock with, and the day of, you slow roast your turkey legs, and then you pan roast your turkey breasts. Or if you're really thinking ahead of time, you can confit your turkey legs up to a couple of weeks in advance, and you store them in that cooking fat in the fridge, right? Make execution a little bit easier. So you would have a turkey stock, preferably. If not, some chicken stock will work. You just buy some chicken stock. You know, get a good organic brand. You always want to try and get the low sodium stuff because you want to have complete control over your sauce and over your flavor. And also, too, you're going to be reducing it even ever so slightly. If you reduce it even a little bit, it could throw your salt out of proportion. Okay, so you got your brown bits in the saute pan. Deglaze. Again, you can use water, you can use brandy, you can use wine, and then reduce. Stock on top.
So again, you reduce it so it's almost dry with the nuts.
Yep. By at least half you want to reduce, but I'll reduce, usually when I'm cooking with wine, I reduce it to where it just barely covers the bottom of my pan. Okay. Deglaze, reduce, stock on top, reduce further. Okay. Why do we reduce? Well, in this case, to intensify flavor. Also, too, as we're gently simmering the stock in the pan with the chopped giblets and the neck and everything else that we have, we're extracting some of the flavor. Not as much if we had thought ahead of time and used those same components to make a stock that we simmer for 6 to 8 hours, right? But we're still going to get more flavor than if we didn't use them at all. All right, so that's a little flavor bonus. But now, because I don't have a stock that I reduced a bunch, if I try to make a demi-glace out of this by reducing and thickening it, first of all, I haven't simmered it long enough to extract the gelatin to actually thicken it by reduction. And number two, it's not going to serve 20 of my family and friends on Thanksgiving. Number three, it's not going to taste like gravy anyways because gravy gets some of its flavor and some of its aroma from that brown roux. So those are the proper decisions for thickening a sauce with a starch or another substance, thickening with cornstarch, thickening with arrowroot, thickening with a roux. If you're saying to yourself, hey, I'm cheap and I'm lazy and I don't really care too much about my flavor, so I'm going to use a roux to thicken some stock and not really give it much thought, then you're doing it for the wrong reason, in my opinion. But if you're making the conscious decision of saying, hey, I'm going to slightly reduce my stock, concentrate those flavors, I'm going to build a fond, I'm going to deglaze that fond, I'm going to add the stock on top, and I'm going to thicken with a nice nutty brown roux because that's an important flavor component in my sauce, then you're adding a roux or an outside thickener or a starch thickener for the proper reason. Same thing with cornstarch, right? I'll use cornstarch a lot. I don't use them in my demi-glaces because it's inappropriate for that technique. A demi-glace should be reduced all the way down and thickened by its inherent gelatin. But if I'm making it like a ginger